So when you hear the phrase vulnerable leader, what does that mean to you? What pops into your mind?
It's just about being sort of authentic and being your true self.
What if how you are is like a rude, a rude person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a jerk. I've never had that in me, but people could. And so maybe vulnerable goes a little bit deeper and trying to establish a personal connection with the people that you're working with and leading.
So why do any of this? Why be vulnerable? Why share? Why are you doing all this stuff?
Because it matters. Because if you have 5,800 people working for you, you need 5,800 people to believe in what you're doing. When I think of being vulnerable, I don't think of the act of doing something different, in a moment to kind of connect with people. The act of being vulnerable is it's how you are. And I don't think everyone has it in them to be that way. I think some people are just very guarded, some people are very controlled, some people are very scripted. But I think being vulnerable, you can tell right away when someone is being honest about their vulnerability, quote unquote, or whether it's a bit of a show. And so for me, it's just about being sort of authentic and being your true self.
What about if how you are is a jerk? What if how you are is like a rude person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess because
you could say, "Hey, I'm being authentic. I'm treating people like garbage. I'm telling everyone that's just me."
Well, and there's lots of CEOs who do that. There's lots of CEOs who've succeeded by doing that. I guess maybe vulnerability has a slightly different element to it. I mean, just drawing out your example. And I was thinking in my own circumstance, I'm not a jerk. I've never had that in me, but people could. And so maybe vulnerable goes a little bit deeper and trying to establish a personal connection with the people that you're working with and leading. And I guess jerks aren't as interested in that. I mean, if you have more of a narcissistic tendency, it's all about you. You're not really interested. So you can be an idiot, a jerk. You can be all these things that aren't terribly compelling and not make a meaningful personal connection with people. So that's something that I've always tried to do.
So why do any of this? Why be vulnerable? Why share? I mean, you could just as easily show up and be the CEO that's like, tell everybody what to do, running the company. Well, why are you doing all this stuff?
Because it matters. Because if you have 5,800 people working for you, you need 5,800 people to believe in what you're doing. You need them to believe in your purpose. You need them to believe in your values, because that's the thing that you want your customers to experience. And if people don't believe it because they don't see it, then they don't care about it. And then they'll decide how they interact with customers. So they'll go through training, they'll learn the process, but they'll inject their own view of what it is that is this company into that interaction.
We talked earlier that there are a lot of leaders who are not like that. There are a lot of leaders who are not vulnerable. They don't share. It's not what they believe in. But there's also a lot of successful leaders like that. So what if somebody says, hey, it's great that you're talking about this stuff, but look at so-and-so. He or she is not like that, and they're running $1 billion company. So why do I need to be vulnerable? It seems like that's just a nice to have and not a requirement.
I think you make a choice in life about how you want to show up. And I think people respond, infinitely better to people that they can relate to, and that people that they trust, and that people, who are what they say they are, not just a version of themselves. So you get to make the choice.
Any suggestions for people who want to be vulnerable? Because, this has been talked about for many, many years. A lot of people are still struggling with it. They're uncomfortable with it. They're thinking about, how do I do it? Where do I begin? So if you're in an organization and you're thinking about being more vulnerable at work, where do you start? How do you break down the walls and show up as you?
Well, you gotta learn about you. I think a lot of people don't have a very informed sense of self. They have a perception of how they should be at work, and so there aren't two versions of yourself. That's, I think, part of the problem is people show up as one person at work, and then they're really another person outside of work. And I think you got to be very comfortable with who you are, and then you have to know who you are, and then you have to figure out how you sit comfortably with that person. that kind of self-awareness is not something you can just pick up a book and learn. Sometimes you need people to help you through that. So probably the best place to start, learn who you are, get a coach.
So my original idea is I wanted to create some sort of a scale as far as what, if you were to think of a scale of what makes people feel least vulnerable versus what makes people feel most vulnerable, what would be on that scale? And so I started asking all these CEOs these questions: what makes you feel least vulnerable and most vulnerable? And I realized that the responses I was getting were completely all over the map, right? One CEO would say, I feel really vulnerable when I speak in front of other people. And another CEO would say, totally good with that, no problem. I feel vulnerable when I have to praise somebody. So I thought, all right, well, there goes that idea. I can't make a scale of any kind. And then I started asking these CEOs, well, why does this make you feel vulnerable? And that's really when the insight came to play as far as the questions that a lot of these leaders are asking themselves. So really, all the things that make leaders feel vulnerable come down to when they have to question themselves in one of four ways. And I call this the, mind, body, heart, and soul. So the first question that makes leaders feel vulnerable is when they have to question their mind. And mind is basically you're questioning a thought or an idea. Right? Oh, why did I think that? That doesn't make any sense. Like, we've all been there. Right? And that's the first thing that can make you feel vulnerable. Especially in a work environment, you're constantly asked to defend your ideas, to share your ideas. So that's one question. The second question is question of the body. Body, these are more actions that you take. So something that you specifically did that is making you feel vulnerable. So very common, the number one response that I got back from CEOs on this was, I feel most vulnerable when I hired somebody and I left them in the role for too long, even though they were hurting the company, and I left them there thinking that I could change them. So this is an action that the CEO took. I hired somebody, I didn't do anything, even though I saw that, they were not a right fit for the role. So this could be any action. It could be creating a new team. It could be asking a question at a meeting. It could be presenting at a town hall, like something actionable that you're doing. The third question that makes leaders feel most vulnerable is question of the heart. Question of the heart is really around like not feeling seen or heard. This is where imposter syndrome comes into play. Like, I don't feel like I belong here. I don't feel like I'm doing a good job. I don't deserve this role. You feel that you are just isolated and alone and nobody can do anything to help you. Like, that's very vulnerable. Then the last question is question of the soul. And question of the soul is really, it's questioning who you are as a leader and who you are as a human being. Like, what kind of a leader am I? What kind of a person am I? Like, why would I do this? Like, these are very deep personal questions that you ask yourself. And so the caveat is sort of the two kind of guidelines for this are, the soul vulnerability is always the most vulnerable for leaders, right? Whenever you're put in a position where you have to question who you are as a person or who you are as a leader, that always makes you feel most vulnerable. The second caveat is that any one of these other ones could lead to soul vulnerability. So, for example, you could start off questioning an idea and saying, oh, that was a dumb idea. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Well, oh, man, why would I even think of that? Like, what kind of a leader am I to have that stupid idea? Like, clearly I don't belong. And all of a sudden you kind of spiral, you get into that. So it starts off as just kind of questioning an idea, and all of a sudden you're questioning, your whole reason for existing. So those are the two caveats behind that. And those are, I found, the four questions that make leaders feel most vulnerable inside of an organization. One of the frameworks that I came up with, which I think is very helpful, and I've shared this with a lot of CEOs, is called the Vulnerability Mountain. And the cover of the book is going to be kind of an adventurer, an explorer who's getting ready to climb this mountain. And that visual is very intentional because I view vulnerability much like climbing a mountain, in the sense that you're going to make mistakes, you'll probably go down the wrong path, you'll probably get injured or hurt, or, it's not an easy climb. But at the same time, when you start to climb that mountain, the beginning is usually a little bit easier towards the beginning, and then it starts to get harder and harder and harder as you get higher up on the mountain. But the higher up on the mountain you climb, the more clarity you get. the more beautiful the view becomes, the more people you will meet on that journey as you are climbing that mountain. So the best recommendation I have, and this is whether you are introverted, whether you're extroverted, it doesn't matter, is you build your vulnerability mountain. And the two easiest points on that mountain to build are the peak and the very bottom. The very bottom is something that you can do now. And that is, for example, sharing what I did over the weekend. Right? That's my first step. Maybe one step up from that is genuinely praising somebody on my team or being able to accept a compliment from somebody else. Maybe one step up on that is ask for help on something small. And you build that mountain, and maybe the top thing on your mountain is sharing a personal challenge or struggle, something that's going on in my personal life that is impacting me at work. But I haven't shared that with anybody. Maybe that's the top of your mountain. So you can build sort of the base of that mountain and the peak of that mountain, and you can gradually take steps to get there. And that's, I think, a very helpful visual for people to keep in mind. And it's important to keep that visual in mind because let's say you listen to this and you watch this and you say, okay, I've never shared anything. Like, I'm not a very vulnerable person. Tomorrow, I'm going to show up to work. I'm going to share everything. I'm going to get to work tomorrow. I'm going to talk about I'm in therapy and I have a tough relationship with my dad and my wife. Do not do that. That's a terrible approach. Leading with vulnerability, one of the big critical components of this is about being authentic, having a level of authenticity in there. And one of the CEOs I interviewed for the book actually told me that he used to work for a CEO who's a very hard-nosed, tough SOB, as he was described, right? He would give you a punch right in the teeth. Like, he was a really tough CEO. And one day this CEO shows up to work and he brings together all of his employees, like his direct reports, into a conference room, and he starts playing the Bette Midler song, You Are the Wind Beneath My Wings. And he gets everybody into a conference room. He's like, hey, come here, I got to talk to you about something. And then imagine all these people in a conference room, and all of a sudden they hear this, You Are the Wind Beneath My Wings, and he's like, you mean so much to me, and this and that. And the CEO that I interviewed, who was working for this CEO at the time, he told me, he's like, we all looked at each other thinking that this guy had a stroke. Like, something is wrong, because it's not in the character. And he said, I would have much preferred that he showed up to work with that same tough attitude, punching you in the teeth kind of, because nobody knew, like, what, this came out of nowhere. This is why it's important to build that vulnerability mountain. The authenticity piece has to be there. So I won't go through the whole framework. I have something called the vulnerability wheel, but at the center of that wheel is the most important aspect of leading with vulnerability, and that is intention. And the key thing here is you should always ask yourself, what is the purpose of me sharing or doing X, Y, Z? And again, there are 5 steps. I don't need to go through all of them, but the intention piece is the most important. So for example, if you are thinking, I should share about, the difficult relationship I have with my dad. I should talk about that I, was fired, 10 years ago from a role. The question you should be asking yourself is why? What is the purpose of you sharing that? And it needs to have some sort of a purpose inside of your organization. Is it to create trust? Is it to solve a problem? Is it to identify a new opportunity? Is it to build better relationships? How is it moving you or the team or the business or the organization forward? If there is nothing there and you're just sharing for the sake of sharing, then that doesn't make sense. Your workplace is not one big therapy session. So, and the context there matters. So ask yourself, what is the purpose behind what it is that I am sharing? And there should be some purpose there. If there's not, don't share it. I think it's pretty clear that today's workforce is not the same workforce that it was even 3 to 5 years ago. And a lot of people are confused and trying to figure out, how do I actually succeed in this new world of work that we're all a part of? And I've been wanting to get back to creating more of these types of educational videos around career and leadership advice. And I want to start with this one today. So what we're going to be looking at in this video are 5 crucial strategies that you should be focusing on if you want to succeed in today's workforce. What are those 5 crucial strategies? Well, you're just going to have to watch the rest of the video to find out. And if you like this type of content, please remember to hit that subscribe button to follow the channel when more of these types of videos are created. Okay, so I've been spending a bit of time putting together some of my favorite pieces of advice that I've collected from a lot of the CEOs that I've interviewed and worked with over the years, from a lot of the research that I've done in some of the books that I've written, and data that I've collected. So I jotted down here what I consider to be 5 of the most important strategies that you should be implementing if you want to succeed in today's workforce. The first one is to focus on the leader fit, not the culture fit. What do I mean by that? Oftentimes when we look for a job, we get very enamored with the company that we want to work for. I was very obsessed with just trying to focus on working for a cool brand, like a Pepsi, like a Apple, like a Microsoft. That's really the only thing that I was thinking of. And it turns out that that's actually a big mistake. So instead of focusing on the brand, instead of even focusing on the culture, what I want you to do is focus on the actual leader that you are going to be working with. Why the leader? Because the leader is going to be the one that will be teaching you, coaching you, guiding you, mentoring you. That's not going to happen because of the brand. And in fact, it's even worth taking a salary cut knowing that you're going to be working for a leader who is going to give you the tools and the insights that you need to help propel you over long-term success. So don't focus so much on the money. Don't focus so much on the brand or the culture. Pay specific attention to who you're actually going to be working with, what they're going to be teaching you, if they're going to be coaching and mentoring you. That is going to be far more relevant and help you in your success than those other things. One of the stories that I wanted to share is from Jim Barr. He's the CEO of the fitness company Nautilus. I actually just interviewed him on my podcast fairly recently, and he actually told me that he turned down a CEO role so that he could take a job working for a leader that he has spent some time working with in the past, Ravi Salagram. And Ravi is the former CEO of Newell. He actually just stepped down fairly recently. And they're the parent company behind brands like Sharpie, Coleman, Rubbermaid, and others. And so what happened is Jim was told that he can have the CEO role. And then Ravi came to him and said, hey, before you take that role, I have something that I want to pitch you first. And I don't think you should take that CEO role. Why don't you come with me and help me transform this other company?
I ended up with a CEO offer, and he did my reference call. And then he calls me up a little bit later and said, but I got this other thing to think about. And I'm like, what? He persuaded me to defer my first CEO gig until later and join him there. And I really, really enjoyed that experience as well.
And that's exactly what he did. So in that case, Jim wasn't focused on the company. He wasn't focused on the opportunity or the money, because let's be honest, he could have got paid a lot more as the CEO of a different company than he could have working for this other brand. So instead, he focused on the leader. So that's the first piece of advice that I have for you. Number 2 is do 10% more than what is asked. This piece of advice came from Mark Randolph. He is the first CEO of Netflix. I've interviewed him on my podcast as well. And what he told me is that during the course of his career, one of the ways that he became successful is he always did 10% more than what was asked of him. This, I think, is especially relevant in today's workforce because quite honestly, it feels like we should be doing 10% more than what is asked of us, but the reality is that we're doing 20% less than what is expected. It feels like a lot of people out there, they want more, but they want to do less to get that more. That's not the best approach that you should be taking. And as organizations, if they ever have to go through layoffs or they have tough economic times, guess who's going to be the first type of employee that they let go? They're going to let go of those employees who do 20% less, but who want 10% more. You should be the opposite. You should be the employee who's willing to do 10% more. Do 10% more than what is asked and expected of you. And I think that will be a huge, huge boost for how you can succeed in today's workforce, especially because I think the work ethic that we once had is starting to die. And hopefully it will come back, but especially when we see that work ethic isn't quite where it used to be, if you can be that person who stands out and is willing to do 10% more, then I think you are going to succeed. To give you a little bit of analogy, if you've ever gone to one of those fancy restaurants, or even some just casual mid-range restaurants, you always love when they bring you something free, right? They bring you that bread on the table. You don't pay for it, but it's just kind of that little extra thing there. It's a little bit more. If you ever go to one of those fancy high-end restaurants where they have prefix menus, they might say it's a 7-course meal or a 10-course meal, but really it's like a 15 or 20-course meal because they bring you a lot of free things in between. And so it's that little bit of extra, that boost, the bread on the table that makes a lot of difference in the eyes of your peers and in the eyes of your leaders. So think about it from that perspective. How can you add that little bit of extra bread on the table in the work that you are doing on a regular basis? So a couple examples of this. Maybe you deliver things early. Maybe if you have a client deliverable, they're expecting something, do a little bit more. Maybe sometimes you are the first one in the office. Maybe sometimes you are the last one to leave. Whatever that 10% is, make sure that you do 10% more than what is asked. The next one, leading with vulnerability. That is the subject of my brand new book that just came out. I think this is going to be a huge thing for you to do. Leading with vulnerability is not the same thing as being vulnerable at work. I think being vulnerable at work can actually hurt you far more than it can help you. Vulnerability is this concept of basically exposing the gaps that you might have. And so this could be gaps in knowledge. This could be gaps in competence. Maybe you're talking about feelings or emotions that are kind of exposing an emotional gap for you. Now, inside of your personal life, that's more relevant, right? If you're talking about this with your spouse, your significant other, and you're exposing and talking about those gaps, trying to get support, that makes sense. Inside of a company, you have a different dynamic. You have a hierarchy, you have a boss, you have employees, you have projects and deadlines, you have the issue of money, right? You're being paid, you have a team dynamic. It is not the same. So I don't advocate for you to just expose the gaps inside of your organization that you have. Instead, you can expose the gaps and also demonstrate what you are trying to do to actually close those gaps. So a very simple example that I see happen all the time inside of organizations. A leader gives a project for somebody to do, and at some point a mistake is made or something doesn't get done the right way. The employee then goes back to the leader and says, I am so sorry. I messed this up. I made a mistake. I feel terrible. I'm sorry about that. That's being vulnerable. That's exposing the gap. Instead, what I want you to do is not just expose the gap, but demonstrate what you're trying to do to close it. So same scenario. I'm so sorry I made that mistake. I know how important this project was, but here's what I learned from my mistake. And here's 3 things that I'm going to do going forward to make sure that mistake never happens again. Now, in the eyes of your peers, in the eyes of your leaders, what you've done there is not just expose the gap, but talking about what you're doing to close the gap. So other people have a different perception of who you are as an employee and as a potential leader. Don't be the person who just walks around your company exposing gaps. Talk about what you are doing to close those gaps. That's what leading with vulnerability is. Whenever there's vulnerability, see if you can add leadership. Leadership is about competence, being good at your job. Vulnerability is about connecting with other people. You need both of those things. Leadership and vulnerability, competence and connection. The next one I have on my list here is think like an owner and not like an implementer. This is, I think, a very, very powerful piece of advice. It came from Kate Johnson. She's now the CEO of a company called Lumen Technologies. And I asked her, when you are leading a team, because she used to be the president of Microsoft in North America, and now she's leading a team of thousands of employees at Lumen Technologies. And when we spoke, I asked her, what is the big factor that you see that separates people who are able to grow and excel in their careers versus those who tend to get stuck in maybe mid-level roles who are not able to branch out or move further, right? They've kind of plateaued in their careers. What separates those who break the plateau versus those who are stuck in that plateau? And what she told me is that those who are able to break the plateau think of themselves more like owners, and those who stay in the plateau are those who think of themselves like implementers. What's an implementer? What's an owner? An implementer is somebody who takes somebody else's vision and somebody else's ideas and implements them. And then when something goes wrong, they say, well, it wasn't my idea. So-and-so gave it to me. That's their problem. And so what happens is you do the work, but you shield yourself from any kind of accountability and responsibility and ownership. And so that's what implementers do. Now, if you want to grow and excel in your career, what you need to do is think more like an owner. An owner is somebody who comes up with the ideas, who devises the solution, who takes ownership of the work that they are doing. Again, whether that is credit or whether that is when you make a mistake, saying that was my idea, I acknowledge it, I take responsibility for whatever was done. So own something from start to finish. If you can think of yourself like an owner, again, your leaders and your peers are going to look at you and they're going to say, wow, this person is an owner. I know that we can count on them to do what needs to get done because they are comfortable overseeing it and owning it. They're not scared from that accountability and from that responsibility. The next piece of advice I have for you is be careful who you take advice from. I made this mistake early in my career. So my quick story is I had bad jobs working for other people around 15 years ago. And so I quit my last corporate job 15 years ago. And I told everybody that I wanted to go build something on my own, that I wanted to create my own business. I wanted to do my own consulting or, whatever it was at the time. And everybody around me told me I was crazy. I lived in Los Angeles at the time and I wanted to move to the Bay Area, because I went to school at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which is pretty close by to the Bay Area. So I was telling my friends, my family members, I'm going to quit. I want to do something different. I'm going to move to the Bay Area and I'm going to try to build something on my own. I don't exactly know what that's going to be yet, but I'm going to explore and play around with some ideas. And my friends and my family members basically said, what are you, crazy? You need to have at least a $60,000 annual salary to live in the Bay Area. And at that time, I didn't even have a job. They said, you don't know what you're doing. It's an expensive place to live. You don't have any experience with this. This is going to fail. And I, for a while, was listening to all of their advice. I never pulled the trigger. I never made that move. Now, long story short, eventually I did move to the Bay Area. I did start doing something on my own, which again, led to me where I am now, creating this video for you, speaking at companies and conferences around the world and writing books and creating content. But the thing that I want to get at is when you take advice from people, the problem that I had is I was taking advice from people who were not doing what I wanted to do. Everybody who I was taking advice from had corporate full-time jobs. So why am I listening to them when they have never built or created anything from scratch the way that I want to? For you, when you're taking advice, whether it's from a leader or from a peer inside of your organization, remember to take advice from other people who have achieved what you want to achieve. If you want to be a leader inside of your organization, take advice from other leaders inside of your company who achieved what you want to achieve. But if you're getting advice from peers, from family members, from friends who have not achieved what you want to achieve, then why would you want to take advice from them, right? You want people who are guiding you, who have been there and who have done that. Otherwise, you could take advice from any random person off the street. Everyone has an opinion. You don't need an opinion, you need guidance. And the way that you can get that guidance is by asking people who have done what you want to do, who have become who you want to become. So that's the last piece of advice I have for you. Be careful who you take advice from. So let's quickly recap these things, the 5 pieces of advice that I think will really help you succeed in today's workforce. We have number 1, focus on the leader fit, not the culture or the brand fit. Number 2, do 10% more than what is asked of you. Number 3, lead with vulnerability. Number 4, think like an owner, not an implementer. And number 5, be careful who you take advice from. I hope this video has added value to you. It will help make you more successful in your career and in your leadership journey. If you want more videos just like this, remember to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you back here on this channel with more content very soon.